Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our kitchen table conversations. We're so happy that you can be here today. This is not an opportunity that we get very often to actually take some time to just have a conversation about an issue that, everyone that's here feels really passionately about. Obviously, we feel very passionately about the topic of domestic violence. So our focus today is to talk about how the words that we use, the language that we use can help impact survivors of domestic abuse for the better and be supportive to survivors. So my name is Megan Rosado. I am the Direct Service Volunteer and Education Coordinator at CAWC, and I'm super happy to have Colleen Montgomery with me here. Do you want to introduce yourself, Colleen?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. Hi, I'm Colleen Montgomery. I'm the Outreach Services Coordinator at CAWC, supervising our hospital crisis intervention project.
Awesome. Great. Yay. And again, thank you all for being here as well. Sorry. Okay. So to just set the table for our presentation today, it's going to look a little bit different than kind of our standard educational trainings or workshops that Megan and I do for our work. First, before we get into that, I want to thank everyone who has helped us put this together. In particular, our development and admin team at CAWC with Tatum and Via, Celia and Jessica. Thank you so much for all your work putting this together and coming up with the idea and inviting us here to be here today. And I want to thank Megan for being an excellent team partner and putting all this presentation together. We've worked really hard on it and we're really excited to share it with you. Some disclaimers before we get into the content. So just some trigger warnings. So we're talking about domestic violence and we're going to be showing a lot of pictures and images today. So I just want to prepare you that there are going to be some images and things that we talk about that could be potentially upsetting for you to hear. So just take care of yourself and do whatever you need to do to feel okay and take a break or whatever you need. Megan and I are always here to talk about our presentations after the fact. So you can always reach out to us later. And all of the content that we're sharing today is going to be shared on our website after we're done with our presentation. So you'll be able to see all the pictures that we're showing. We'll have our sources and citations there for your reference. And there will be a transcription of everything that we say today. We're hoping this conversation generates further thinking and reading and learning about the domestic violence movement. We're not necessarily here to give you a bunch of answers today. We are going to give you some options and some things to think about, but hopefully this will encourage further education for you. And lastly, the thing I want to say, so Megan just shared in the chat box our CAWC hotline. Thank you for sharing that. In that fashion, as we go along today, we really want you to be engaged as much as you want to be engaged today. So if you are going through this, have a question or a comment or another example or a reaction to something that we share, please feel free to add it to the Zoom chat box as we go along. Megan and I will do our best to check on the chat box and nudge each other here or there when we need to and bring up your comments in this public space so that we can all kind of have a conversation together. And here and there, we'll have some questions for you too, where we hope to get some feedback from you as we go along. Did I miss anything? You got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
I'm super excited for our first course. So basically, we have structured our conversation today into three sections. So first, we're going to spend a little bit of time really thinking about the historical perspectives. Then we will be showing and discussing ways that domestic violence shows up in our culture. And then finally, bringing this all back to the main topic, how does this affect the experiences that survivors have who are experiencing abuse?
Yeah, and ultimately what we're going to be sharing with you, especially towards the end, are going to be things that you can say or think about that can save people's lives. Mm-hmm. So before we jump into that agenda,
we just want to go over, why does this matter? You know, why are we here? Why are we talking about this? Why are we doing another training over your lunch break when you're very busy already? You know, why should anybody care about this? And Megan and I have some ideas about that we're going to share with you here. So from a report from the United Nations that was released in 2021, but had data from 2020, 47,000 women and children were killed worldwide in the year 2020 by members of their family. And when we look at that on a smaller scale, that means that one woman or girl is killed by someone in her family every 11 minutes, which is just horrifying. So when we think about that in our hour-long presentation today, that's about 5 or 6 women who are going to get murdered throughout this time that we're together by someone in their family all across the world. So people are dying.
Can you guys see our PowerPoint? I don't think so.
Oh, my screen is being shared. Oh, thank you, Stephanie. Good point, Megan.
All right, let's pause for a second.
Yeah.
Well, we can figure that out. Or should we continue on?
Come on now. Let me stop and try again.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Screen can only be seen by host and co-hosts. Why is that? I don't know.
Are you back in focus mode again?
Oh, let me go back. There we go. Let's see if that works.
Can anyone see here? Let me stop share. I'll do it
right now. Redo it, yeah.
Shared screen seen only by host and co-host.
Can you make Colleen a co-host, please?
Ah,
there we go. We got it. Yay!
Oh, yay.
All
Okay.
right. Woo, welcome back.
First round. Okay.
Thank you. This is our first time, so doing this
And none of us have done, yeah, right. none of us have done this
with
before.
like multiple, tech people involved.
Right.
So yeah.
All right, thank you for your patience. So back to that horrific fact. So people are dying. So that should be enough to care about this issue. Does anyone know who this is? You can put it in the chat if that looks familiar to you. Right, thanks, Jess. Yeah, that's Gabby Petito. And she is a domestic violence victim who it seems like, a lot of people heard about, who was murdered by her partner over the summer. And if you remember, there were those horrific videos of the police stopping them. And as a DV advocate, we could just see what was going on and how she was behaving and the victim blaming that she was doing. Well, that was a case that happened that got national attention, right? What about this person? Does anyone know who that is? Yeah, so right, so that's the problem. Yeah, so this is Mandeep Kaur, and Mandeep Kaur died by suicide this summer in New York because after experiencing physical and emotional and psychological abuse from her husband for the entire time that they were married, at least 8 or 10 years, if I remember correctly. There are videos that are available showing the abuse actually happening. And this screenshot here is a still from a video that she sent to her father right before she died by suicide, explaining to him what had been going on, the fear that she lived in, how her husband never forgave her for not giving him sons. They had 2 little girls, and that she couldn't live with the abuse anymore. And so she died by suicide. Thankfully, New York is prosecuting that husband for murder. I forget exactly the charges, but they are holding him accountable for his role in her suicide. But I just want to reflect that her news, she lived in New York, did not make national news. And she's a woman of color, someone who died by suicide due to domestic violence, and nobody knows that happened.
Well, now we do.
Yes,
So-
no,
Thank you for sharing that.
yeah. So to just continue that discussion, from this report here, this is a report of homicides that were related to domestic violence in Chicago. So bringing it a little bit closer to home. And we can see that there's a disproportionate impact on Black women who have died by homicide in Chicago, 86%, compared to 9% of Hispanic women, 2% of white women, and 2% unknown. So there's a huge disparity in who's dying by homicide due to domestic violence. In addition to that, the data from 2021 showed that shootings and homicide by firearm are going up. So this issue is not getting any better. It's getting worse, and more people are dying year by year. This image here is from another reason of why does this matter. From a shooting that took place in 2018 at Mercy Hospital in Chicago. One of the victims was Tamara O'Neal, who was a domestic violence survivor at the time before she was murdered by her ex-fiance, who came to the hospital where she worked at Mercy and opened up gunfire on her. He also murdered another pharmacist, a resident. Her name was Dana Less, and then throughout the ordeal also murdered an officer, Samuel Jimenez. So 2 other people died because of this domestic violence act in the hospital. Furthermore, more recently, just this summer, there was a shooting in Humboldt Park, which is very close to where CWC office is, at a restaurant called Caramba, I think it is, where an abuser was trying to shoot and kill his ex-girlfriend who worked at this restaurant, but he missed her and killed another bystander instead. He killed a 50-year-old man who was in the restaurant, and I think I have his name, Felipe Ruiz. He did not end up, thankfully shooting his ex-partner, but I was reading an article that he actually 3 days prior had attempted to murder her by shooting at her, and he was still out after that, and then this incident happened. So, we at CWC view domestic violence as a public health issue, but if that can be hard for someone to connect to, Megan and I feel like these examples showcase how domestic violence does not just happen in a home, it happens out in the public where we all live and exist. And we need to do something about this. That's a problem. People are dying. The last thing I want to add is, attending presentations like this and working with agencies like CAWC can help transition you from what we call either an activist or an advocate. And maybe I'm sure you've heard those words before. I have known those words and used those words before, but only recently did I actually attend a training where someone asked me, well, what do those words mean? And I wasn't really able to answer it, except that I talk about the work that I do, right? And I know I'm an advocate, and we are advocates on the ground. But it was explained to me in a really helpful way that both types of roles are needed in a movement. And activists are people who, when they hear about these horrific stories, like what I just shared with you, they get out and they march, they make signs, they chant and talk to the people in power to get laws changed and to make their world safer. An advocate, and for the activists, they are very helpful in making awareness, but they don't necessarily know the education behind the issue that they're fighting for. Whereas advocates are people who are more educated in the issue that they're talking about. And they're educated in a way that they can also teach other people to be able to talk about that issue. So both roles are very needed, and attending presentations like this, Megan and I were talking about, can help transition someone, if you're feeling more like an activist, to an advocate to help you feel more educated and more informed about the domestic violence movement.
Thanks.
Mhm. So historical perspective. So Megan and I were doing a deep dive on how did we get here? When did domestic violence start? When did the imbalance of power and men feeling superior to women begin? And I just want to ask before we show our first clip here, can anyone think of how far back we maybe had to go to find a time when men and women were treated equally? You can guess, just put it in the Zoom chat. Never. Thank you, Robin. Okay, well, we'll go with never.
We're almost never, right?
We're pretty close to never. Yes. Yeah, Stephanie, the question was, how far back did we have to go to find a time when men and women were treated equally? Far, like thinking about our civilization. Well, you keep thinking about that. What we found, we had to go back as 2.5 million years ago. So almost never. Yeah, thank you everyone for sharing. We had to go back to what's called the prehistoric age or the Paleolithic age, to where at least the resources and the citations that we had, at least interpreted what is left from that time period.
Right.
As men and women being equals. So again, 2.5 million years to 10,000 BC was that time period. And this was a time, at least according to what is left over and what we're interpreting, where women were viewed as equals to men, but also divine in a way because of their ability to create humans. So their ability to birth and create life. So they were revered for that ability and that power that they had. This image here is of a piece of art that is called Venus of Willendorf. And it's possibly the oldest piece of art. I was doing some reading on this that exists from that time period, the prehistoric time period, which I can't even really wrap my mind around how long ago that was.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting interpretations of it. And just to share, the first interpretation of it was done by a bunch of men who were extractors and found it, and interpreted it as a sculpture that was created by a man to show a woman who didn't have feet and didn't have arms or hands and focused on the birthing and nurturing parts of her body, so her breasts and her stomach and her genitals. But then like 40 years later, finally, there were some women in the field who had a chance to take a look at this and interpret it and used a female perspective to look at this and thought, you know, if you think about it, it might just be a woman who's looking down on herself and what she can see from that perspective, because there probably weren't mirrors back then,
Right.
as far as I know. So it you know, makes more sense of what a body would look like when it's sitting down, let's say. You're looking down on it. You probably also couldn't see your face back then. So that might explain why there's no face, why there's no feet, no arms. She couldn't see it. But maybe she knew, you know, what her hair looked like by plaiting it or doing it for somebody else. So interesting to get.
It makes me wonder who created it, right?
Yeah.
How did they identify themselves, right? That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's an interesting perspective.
Something to think about. So we're going to move closer to current day with just some important parts of our history that we thought were, you know, definitely related to the domestic violence that women experience, women and other genders, which we'll get into later. But moving closer to current day, we're getting into the agricultural revolution and the Neolithic age from 10,000 BC to 3000 BC. And frankly, I have not thought about these ages since I was probably in elementary school. Yeah,
for sure.
I had to look up what they were and what they meant. But this is the time where, at least according to the sources that we have, there started to be the division of power between men and women. So this is kind of like the origin story of where the division started. And during this time, there was a shift from the prehistoric hunter-gatherer community lifestyle to agriculture and farming. And this created a shift in how communities were created, where during the prehistoric age, it was more nomadic and people were moving around searching for food. Whereas the agricultural revolution brought the rise of communities and like villages being raised up together and farming food. So they had to live by that food to grow it. With this change, there was a boom in the population because people were able to eat a more variety of nutrient-dense food. There was also during this time a shift in the belief of incest, where incest became taboo. So from our understanding before this time, incest was more common with people with inside a family marrying within that family, or getting together and procreating from that. But with incest becoming taboo, men and women and families had to look outside of their families to strangers, let's say, or people in their community to marry and grow a family. So with this shift in perspective, they had to figure out, how do we pair up, right? And what happened is that men decided to rape other women to pair up with them. That's how they claimed their territory of women. But this is when we started to see women being treated as property and as something to claim to further a family's power in the community. And women had no choice in this, of course. Rape is used intentionally. In one of our sources, a writer referred to it as an open season of rape to claim women as wives. So this is where we have seen the origin of men believing and exerting their own power over women.
So, thanks, Colleen, for explaining that and for bringing me back to elementary school with the different eras and everything.
Yeah.
So as Colleen was saying, really, the origin of domestic violence, abuse, gender-based violence can be traced back to centuries ago, to the development of patriarchal and hierarchical systems of authority in which men controlled property and where women and children were often considered to be property, right? So the growth of these male-oriented societies promoted the widely accepted belief in male superiority, which formed the basis for women's subordination. And this belief in men's domination over women, it was often supported by economic, social, cultural, and religious institutions, which made it acceptable for men to be using violence as a way to control women. So we are showing now a picture of a stone slab, and it is the Code of Hammurabi. So who knows who Hammurabi is? Feel free, anybody know? Right? If folks at least maybe heard the name Hammurabi. So Hammurabi was the ruler, the king of Babylonia, who reigned from 1792 to 1750 BC. And this code was a collection of 282 rules that established standards for commercial interactions, set fines, punishments, to meet the requirements of what they considered at that time to be justice. And the edicts ranged from family law to professional contracts and administrative law. And often there were different standards of justice for three different classes of people in Babylonian society. The property class, so men, right? the freedmen and the slaves. So under this code, women and children were being regarded as property, and they really had no rights under this law. In fact, some of the laws in Hammurabi's code explicitly mandated men to use violence against their wives and children in certain situations. So if a woman was caught committing adultery, her husband could tie her up and drown her. A wife could be legally drowned if she left her husband without being able to prove his cruelty to her. And if a son struck his father, his hands could be cut off. So, yeah, and this is, written in this stone tab that was found at some point in the early 20th century, I think early 1900s. This stone tab was uncovered, and so we're able to trace it back to those times.
So this was the first time that we know of laws existing that gave men permission and examples of how to
Actually treat relationships.
and use violence up to murder.
Yeah.
Great. Something else that we found in our research was this was also the first time that bride prices were noted in our history. So if you've heard of bride prices before, it was a custom that is still practiced in some cultures, where the bride's, it's the husband's family that has to pay the bride's family, right? This was the first time that was started, and it was looked at as a less cruel way than rape to claim a woman as a bride, which I guess I agree with them there. It is less cruel than rape, but it's still treating women as property. So that's the first time that we see that. You want to do this one? You want me to? This one. Okay. We have a quote here from Aristotle, a very famous philosopher, and this is going to move us into 300 AD, that we thought was very poignant and really reflective of the views at that time. So during this time period was when religion started to come up and become very popular. So people's viewpoints and men's viewpoints were shaped by what they were being taught by other men who ran churches and religious institutions.
Are great thinkers.
Right, yes. And one of those great thinkers, Aristotle, was quoted as saying, again, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules the man and the other is ruled. This principle of necessity extends to all kind. So just very blatantly putting men above women in those roles. Also during this time was when we started to see that women were believed to be innately evil. And this was based in religion, where women, through no behaviors or actions of their own, were just believed to be born as evil humans. And so the violence was needed to keep them in line because they were evil. So it's another way to justify harming and murdering women.
So this is showing portrayal of the 1800s, which is when the temperance movement.
Wait, hang on, before you get to that, let me do the witch hunt craze.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I have the wrong one.
Yeah. Before Megan gets to that, another important time of our history is the witch hunt craze, which was from over 200 years, from 1560 to 1760. And maybe you've heard of this before, but this was a time when there was a mass genocide of women across Europe and Asia, mostly in those areas, but then also in the Americas, where women were being murdered legally by law for being witches. And so this is tied into what we just talked about with women being believed to be innately evil. And also that during this time period, women had started to gain some power, and they had gained that power by becoming healers of other women, in particular, specifically related to their reproductive stages. So experiencing pain during their menstrual cycles or when giving birth, those times are very painful. Other women became healers by helping those women who were going through those periods to manage that pain and to experience actual comfort, which I'm sure was crazy at that time. But because of this, the men couldn't stand that, and they had gained some power in their lives, and they put into law that women could not, there were like schools at that time, but they put into law that women could not go to those schools, only men could go to those schools, of course. So the belief was that if women can be healers without having gone to a medical school, then they must have learned that information from the devil. And if they've learned that information from the devil, then they should be murdered and put to death, right? So this is an image that just depicts a woman in a trial of all men, condemning her to death, presumably. The sources that we have estimate that during this time period, somewhere between 200,000 to 10 million women were murdered in 200 years. Right. So naturally, as you might expect, women learned during this time that the safest way to survive was to mind her own business, not say anything, not ask for help, and just be obedient to her husband. Because that's what she had to do to survive.
Yeah. So backlash is a theme that came up a lot in our preparing for this, right? Every time that we were seeing some action to, kind of change the power dynamics and, to bring us back to the point of being more divine, then we result in something like, women are evil. And I'm sorry for before, these two images are super similar in my view when I'm getting ready to talk about them. So I skipped ahead, but this is representing the 1800s. And as I was saying, the temperance movement I'm going to talk about in a moment, but we did see during the 1800s and maybe before some beginnings of recognizing that it wasn't just okay to kill somebody was not okay, right? Wow. Even if it was your partner. And so this idea of reasonable chastisement came into focus. So Calvin Bradley versus the state of Mississippi was the first American legal ruling on the subject of reasonable chastisement. And in this case, the Supreme Court of Mississippi found that Bradley, who had been convicted by a lower court of assault and battery against his wife, had actually gone too far in chastising his wife. So this was the first major court case that seemed to limit a husband's ability to physically abuse his wife beyond common law. That was at the time, a lot of our earlier colonial laws were based off of English common law. And so this court found that if the defendant now before us could shew from the record, in this case, confined himself within reasonable bounds when he thought it proper to chastise his wife, we would deliberate long before an affirmance to this judgment. So they affirmed the lower court's decision to hold him guilty, but they said that it was only because he was not able to show to the court that he had valid reasons to carry his violence and abuse to the extent that he had. So while criticizing Bradley for bringing shame to his family, the court ruled the husband should still be permitted to exercise the right to use of modern chastisement in cases of great emergency and to use salutary restraint in every case of misbehavior without subjecting himself to vexatious prosecutions for assault and battery, resulting in the discredit and shame of all parties concerned. So here we see that Bradley brought shame upon his family, yet it's also his wife bringing shame, right? Everyone is sharing equally in this blame.
And she be disobedient.
Right. Yeah. This is not really something that should be brought into the courts, even though we are affirming the lower court's decision. And then moving on, some of the earliest movements against domestic abuse we saw in the temperance movement. So that can be traced back to the 1830s. And, most of you probably know it aimed to prohibit the sale, production, and distribution of alcohol. The earliest organization of the temperance movement was controlled by men, but by the 1840s, the movement had been taken over by white middle-class women. And these women believed that drinking excessively led to spousal abuse, and they were seeking to eliminate the source of the problem. So many temperance activists believe that domestic abuse was a byproduct of drunkenness. Now, we know today that that is not alcohol or drug use is not a cause. It certainly can create more complications. It can create a more dangerous situation, but it is not the cause of abuse. And we're going to get more into what, some of these causes are as well, and the different types of abuse that are used. But it's not hard to understand from this, as well as other examples, why that myth is still prevalent in our society today. The temperance movement, there were some women in the movement, some feminists in the movement who did take the argument farther, as recognizing domestic abuse as being a gendered problem. So Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, Amelia Bloomer, they all campaigned for the liberalization of divorce laws as being a logical extent of the temperance movement, and it's equating drunkenness with domestic violence. And so these women were arguing that changes to divorce practice were a moral necessity, and they considered it, a cruel perversion of marriage and motherhood to require a woman to stay in a relationship with somebody who was abusive to her. Kind of language that they used was someone who was made brutish by alcohol. There actually was a split in the temperance movement, basically along these lines of the gender issue, so that is an interesting topic that unfortunately we don't have time to go into today. Maybe we can talk about it another time. But we did start to see this shift. And by 1850, there were some states that were granting divorce on the grounds of cruelty, which was vaguely defined though. And ultimately, there wasn't any recourse for the survivors themselves. It really was up to them to consider, again, as we had seen in the other cases that I had just mentioned, what did they see as being serious enough, right? What was the perspective of the individual judges that were hearing these cases? So again, we had this idea about domestic abuse really being a private matter. And so another case that came up in 1864 was State versus Jesse Black. And that really illustrated the assertion that upon marriage, husbands become the rulers of their wives. So this case involved a man who abused his wife after she called him names. And in this ruling, the court said a husband is responsible for the acts of his wife, and he is required to govern his household. And for that purpose, the law permits him to use violence towards his wife to such a degree of force as is necessary to control an unruly temper and make her behave herself. And unless some permanent injury be inflicted, or there be an excess of violence or such a degree of cruelty as it shows that it is inflicted to gratify his own bad passions, the law will not invade the domestic forum or go behind the curtain. And then 10 years later, the North Carolina court, again, they were expressing some concern about excessive abuse, but they were advising against public scrutiny or interference. So in State versus Richard Oliver, the court found that if no permanent injury has been inflicted, nor malice, cruelty, nor dangerous violence shown by the husband, it is better to draw the curtain. Again, it's interesting they use those same, I guess it was only 10 years later in the same court, shut out the public gaze and leave the parties to forget and forgive. Probably the same judges actually making that decision.
So it was just like if you get married, you're gonna be abused. Like that's just a natural part of the marriage.
Right.
And maybe they'll temper it so you don't die from it, but they're gonna abuse you.
Right, and really, we shouldn't talk about it because it's gonna bring shame to everybody that's involved, and this is that private matter, yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Including the wife who brought it upon herself for being
Mhm.
unruly and having thoughts.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So again, as we're starting to see some of these changes in the 19th century and the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we're seeing some states enact laws that forbid domestic abuse, and court decisions that are affirming that, again, reasonable chastisement. However, in almost all cases, there's still there's no civil recourse. So any criminal proceedings that a wife wanted to bring against her husband had to be initiated by the state. And there was no civil, the wives did not have the ability to sue their husbands. And we saw that affirmed when we come to, so, anybody know what this is a picture of? Yeah. Okay, so this is the Supreme Court in 1910. And the reason why we're showing this is because there was a case in front of the Supreme Court at that time, Thompson versus Thompson, and the wife sued the husband for damages for an assault, claiming the right to do so under the statute of the District of Columbia, which gave women, married women, the right to sue for torts committed against them as if they were unmarried. So she was trying to bring a civil case against her husband. And ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that a wife had no cause for action on an assault and battery charge against her husband because it would open the doors of the courts to all kinds of accusations of all sorts of one spouse against another and bring into public notice complaints for assault, slander, and libel.
Thank you, Megan, for that deep dive. into
I
the
know,
history.
right?
Yeah.
Me too.
I think for time, for this one, I'm just gonna kind of
Mhm.
roll through them.
Go through
If
them.
that's good for you. Yeah.
Mhm.
So what we want to show now is how does this history, how does domestic violence show up in our culture? And we're going to start from 1950 to 1990, and then the next slide will be from 1990 to present day. So when we say culture, we're going to show you things from the media, from advertisements, movies and news articles, social media when that came through in the 90s, and all sorts of things that we see in our day-to-day life. As we go through this, definitely think about how this impacts you seeing these images. Some of them are pretty upsetting, but also think about how either you as an adolescent or any adolescent would be viewing these images. Because we know that due to where their brains are in the development stage and they're very focused on themselves and learning about their identity, whatever they take in, they're going to be the most vulnerable to take that in and use it to form their own identity. So what are these things teaching adolescents about who they are and who other people are in their communities? So we're going to start with this ad from 1950 from Heinz if you notice in the first couple sentences, it says most husbands nowadays have stopped beating their wives, but what can be more agonizing to a sensitive soul than a man's boredom at meals? So it doesn't even hide the fact that beating wives is acceptable in 1950. And that this is the start of what you'll see a lot of advertisements talking to women about what they can do to keep their husbands calm and peaceful, because it's their job to stop them from becoming abusive, not the men's job to stop being an abuser. This is another very blatant ad. This one's from 1952. It's a coffee ad showcasing a husband beating her wife for not store testing for fresher coffee. Yeah, definitely worth it, I would say. This one from 1953 literally says, "Is it always illegal to kill a woman?" at the top of the ad. And this is for a post. What?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Megan.
In case anyone wasn't clear on that.
This is for a postage meter, but frankly, it doesn't matter what this ad is for. This was run and I read through the script as much as I could decipher it. And the question is from the man posing it after hearing this woman's thoughts. So all of this copy here is the two of them having a conversation and the man trying to understand the woman's thoughts about this product. And he gets so frustrated with her for sharing her thoughts about this product that he questions, is it always illegal to kill a woman? So killing her for her own thoughts. This is a Budweiser ad, and this one is from 1956. And it says she found she married 2 men. In fact, all women do. There's always that inner man, so it's kind of like a wink, wink. And think of all the planning that goes into meals to make him contented. So the inner man that they're referring to is the abuser. So she can buy Budweiser to keep that inner man tucked away, and Budweiser will keep the man happy and stop him from abusing her.
So go ahead and
Go to the next,
sorry.
where we at? To the next slide.
Mhm.
Sure. Okay. There's more ads in here. Again, this will be all up on our website. We are running low on time, so you can see all of these once we're done with the presentation. We're going to clip through to 1990 to the present time. You want to do this one? No. Yeah. So starting in the 90s, this is a picture of Janet Reno, who was the first female attorney general, and Anita Hill, who was a White House staffer who gave testimony against Clarence Thomas, our current Supreme Court justice, for sexual assault. Right.
Yeah.
And Via just went like this. That's the word. I put these women's photos up here because in the 90s is when we started to see women gaining more power, right, and having more space, owning more space in public spaces. But what was coupled with that was men trying to take away their power. So both of these women were utterly destroyed in the media about their personalities, about their look. Janet Reno in particular was demonized for looking the way that she does. Anita Hill was called a liar, doing this for other reasons than for safety reasons and her own experience. She was not believed. So the 90s were full of that. So think about adolescents experiencing that in the 90s and what that teaches them about gaining power. That makes it pretty scary to them if they're going to just be torn apart. I'll keep going.
So I think, for folks as you kind of go on, if you think about, again, as we were mentioning that backlash earlier, right?
Mhm.
Once women were starting to gain more power. So what do we know happened right around this time in the early 90s, right?
Mhm.
That was the signing of the Violence Against Women Act, right?
Right.
And really a high point in our movement. So again, we see this, all these changes in the response to it.
Yep, gaining power and taking it back. This is an ad from Vogue from 2012 that showcases a man attempting to choke a woman and equate domestic violence with sexuality. Another ad from a vodka company in 2014. This one was on Facebook. So just to show an example of how this started to infiltrate through the internet. An experience that Kourtney Kardashian had, whatever you feel about her, she does not deserve to be called a piece of machinery by her partner. Another Facebook ad that is horrific. This could be us, but you keep escaping. So it's a man who's literally tied up his partner to stay with him. Another ad from Dolce & Gabbana stimulating gang rape of this woman who's being held down and the men leering over her. Some reviews of, I don't know if anyone here has seen Big Little Lies, but it does showcase domestic violence between a husband and a wife. And these reviews here are highlighted because they're from men who talked about that the abuse part of the show being really unoriginal and like an example of what they call it, S&M sex games, and boring, as opposed to it being a really horrific representation of domestic violence, physical and psychological. And then we have some news ads here. Lovers quarrel ends in gunfire. As if it wasn't the abuser that took the gun to shoot the victim in that situation, blaming on the relationship, not the abuser. And we see the same thing here from a news ad in 2022, just this summer. California woman stabbed to death over failed dating relationship. No, she was stabbed to death by an abuser, not a dating relationship.
Right.
Our tips.
Yeah,
You want to start this one?
sure.
Go through
Um, so the whole point of why we're here, right? How do we want to be looking at, what are things that we can say? What are things that we should make sure that we never do, right? So our first one is to never victim blame, right? So can you talk more about this?
Yeah, so we want to believe victims and survivors when they tell us what's going on, and hold the, to go to the second tip, hold the offenders accountable for choosing to abuse their victims. So instead of asking, why isn't the victim just leaving the relationship, ask, why is that person abusing that person?
And notice the times when we do that unintentionally,
Mhm.
right? So oftentimes I will ask people in trainings or when I'm interviewing people for staff or volunteer positions, why do you think domestic violence happens? And the response that I might get can be really understanding and empathetic responses to why victims stay, but not actually answering why does abuse happen, right? And what we know is that domestic violence is a choice. It is a learned behavior, as we've just shown through our examples. It's a widespread problem, and it's never the victim's fault.
Right. Some other tips to put on here is to voice that domestic violence is an intersectional issue. So what we've gone through today was mostly depictions of white men against white women. And it's funny, when we were talking about this, we had a hard time finding examples of domestic violence in the media that included the intersection of other isms. So like classism, racism, ableism, whatever ism you want to have. And we thought that it was like a layered discrimination in the media, that they were showcasing domestic violence in a way that blames the victim, but also not showcasing that domestic violence does not just happen in white families. It happens to people of all social groups. And as we saw in the data before, it disproportionately affects Black women in Chicago and beyond.
It also disproportionately affects lesbian women, bisexual. Actually, bisexual women experience the highest proportion of domestic abuse compared to the rest of the population. And actually, I should take that back. In terms of gender identity, well, I guess not take it back, but in terms of gender identity, transgender women and transgender people, individuals. So in the 2015 US Transgender Survey, over 54% of respondents experienced some form of intimate partner violence, including acts involving coercive control and physical harm.
Yep. We're hoping that this presentation is going to help you question the way that the media portrays domestic violence, and maybe encourage you to open up discussions when you see examples like this that aren't in line with the education and the knowledge that we have about domestic violence today, to talk about it with the people around you. Because as that last point says, it's important to remember that domestic violence affects all of us. And no matter who you're with, whether you know it or not, they could be in a situation that's domestically violent, or they might know someone who is. And the more we talk about it and the more we draw attention to it, the more we can help people and the more we can save lives.
So everyone that is joining us on the call, if you haven't experienced abuse yourself, you know somebody that has experienced abuse. It is everywhere. It is affecting everyone, regardless of, different status or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation. And it's really important that we discuss these, these topics with our loved ones. And so we really want to challenge you to take this conversation to your own table, whether it's your kitchen or your lunchroom or the coffee table in your living room, right? The picnic table in the park. Post about it on your social media, support agencies like CAWC through either donations or volunteering, but not just do that, but also talk to people about the fact that you're taking those actions. One thing that I do want to mention is that we could really use your help, as you saw in, a large portion of this presentation really focused on legislation with regards to domestic abuse. And so one, thing that I can suggest to you is that if you actually go to the Network Advocating Against Domestic Violence, you can sign up for their policy action alerts and get notifications whenever there is important actions that need to be taken to either try and support different acts or possibly oppose different acts that we think might be harmful to survivors. So one thing you can do is you can go to their website, but you can also text Network GBV to 52886 to sign up for those alerts. So I will put those in the chat.
Yeah, and I just want to add to, I had a private message come through asking what to do if you talk to someone who tells you they are being abused. And being connected with an agency like CAWC is a perfect resource to give to that person. You can give them our hotline number or our direct line here at the office, and our counselors are here and ready to be able to assist them. Our hotline is available 24/7. Megan, you put that in the chat at the beginning of our presentation. And there's also the Illinois and the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which both have different options of access for audio calls, text to talk calls, texting, and using the internet. So there's lots of different avenues to connect with the resource. And then to end on a message of hope, we have some examples here of how the media is evolving to portray things that we can do to further domestic violence movement to end domestic violence for all. And this picture here is an example from Gillette. If you've seen this, this was an ad that started in the 1980s and it's continuing now, where Gillette is asking the question or telling men to be the best men that they can be. And so these ads give examples of men teaching other men and calling out their behavior when it's abusive. This picture here is a man teaching two young boys not to use violence, but to honor their feelings in a different way. This picture is from a Gillette ad of a man stopping a man from harassing a woman on the street. This is a picture Megan found of a mural in New York, I believe, showcasing domestic violence, bringing awareness to it in the community.
It's called The Survivor's Journey, and the artist is Joel Berger.
Thank you. This is another program. It's called Coaching Boys into Men, I believe it is. And it's the same concept as the Gillette ad of teaching boys to honor their feelings and to not use violence to express those feelings.
If you're a coach, I encourage you to check it out. Or if you know a coach.
We are in, of course, a Domestic Violence Awareness Month that was started. I have it.
In the 80s.
Is that when it was? Okay, thank you, Megan. So bringing awareness that way every year throughout the whole month, which CAWC is doing. And recently we had our Run to NDV walk, or what's it called?
These are just examples of two different events that CAWC has been involved in. So one is we've had a team as part of the Chicago Marathon, run DV out of town, which has been a collaboration with several domestic violence agencies. And then the other is our annual Domestic Violence Awareness March and Rally, which is aptly called Silent Too Long, Silent No More. A lot of times when we are talking about people that have lost their lives due to violence, and in this case, domestic violence, we are in a period of mourning, and we, honor them by moments of silence, right? But we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we are speaking up about this issue. And again, not keeping it in the closet, not keeping it as a private family matter. And so again, we invite you all to join us.
Thank you. And that is what we have for you today. It is 1:01. So we don't have time for questions today, but Megan, my information is in this PowerPoint slide. You can always reach out to us here at the office. Again, this will all be posted on our website after today. So if you have any questions or comments or want to have further discussion, please reach out to us. And thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all for being here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, Colleen. That was a real treat. I appreciate the time that we got having to, have this conversation and really think about these issues on a deeper level.
Me too.